We're welcoming back Beth Buelow. Beth was with us in October of 2018, and I had the pleasure of meeting Beth through the Michigan chapter of ICF. Beth has been a leader in that chapter since I met her, and she also had shared, last time she shared with us, that she has also been a Presbyterian deacon, and so knows something about Presbyterianisms and idiosyncrasies, and so we thought it was also a good match. Beth is a PCC who is really committed to supporting leaders and their teams in creating what she calls a positive culture of communication and connection. She's a coach, a mediator, and facilitator with more than a decade of coaching experience. Her clients have ranged from leaders in international organizations to entrepreneurs to intrapreneurs. I like that, intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs. She specializes in mentor coaching, conflict resolution, and interpersonal communication. As I said, she serves in leadership on the board of the Michigan ICF as the education and training chairperson, and she's also the president-elect of the chapter. She did a podcast called How Can I Say This, which has reached listeners in more than 65 countries. Amazing, since it launched in August of 2018. She's also an author of a book called The Introvert Entrepreneur: Amplify Your Strengths and Create Success on Your Own Terms, which is published by Penguin Random House in 2015. So Beth, welcome back. She's going to be talking today, leading us through some of the new language around the core competencies. So we want to understand that as we continue to either get certified or recertified or pursue the next level certification. So really important for us to understand where things are at now. So Beth, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Let me jump in 1 second. I'll let everybody know.
Dana.
I'm going to mute everybody else for now while Beth's speaking, but she said she's going to have some times for questions. Unmute yourselves at that time if and when you want to ask something.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dana. Yeah. I didn't realize I was muted.
Yeah.
So
no, sorry.
Okay.
Everybody and then unmute you. Yeah.
So as I'm going, if you've got questions and I haven't paused yet and you want to capture it, please feel free to use the chat. And if I don't see it, right at the time, then I will, we'll pull that in as we go. As Dana said, I'm going to spend some time, giving some straight content, basically kind of doing an overview walkthrough of the new core competencies that ICF Global rolled out in November of last year. And mostly going to highlight some of the new language and new emphasis that they've put on different aspects of the coaching partnership. And then there's time at the end where I've got a few guiding questions that I hope we can have a conversation about what you have, what you've learned and what you've noticed about the competencies and the differences in the language. I welcome your questions on, any questions that come up. Whether or not I'm able to answer them, I don't know, because I think ICF is also still working on, how exactly is this all going to roll out and impact both people who are getting certified next year as well as recertified moving forward. So I'll share what I know, but as always, if I can't answer something, then it's always best to check with ICF. They're very responsive in responding to questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bring us into the competency. So can everyone see that? If I can just get a couple of nods. Okay. And let me move to presentation mode. All right. So I call this out with the old, in with the new, specifically a question mark, because while there are new competencies to be explored, there's still a great deal that is carried over from the old competencies. So it's really not throwing them out, but it's rather a pretty major refresh and recalibration of these competencies. Whoops. So some context from ICF Global. The competencies were introduced in 1998, which is just maybe a couple of years after ICF was founded. They're celebrating their 25th anniversary this year. And the last time the competencies were reviewed and updated was 2008. So it's been about a 12-year span of time since they were last seriously looked at. And they started this whole process of looking at them about 24 months ago. So they did, 2 years worth of research, and they involved 1,300 plus coaches internationally. And they made a point to include both ICF members and non-members. They wanted to make sure that they were capturing not just the experience of the ICF credentialed coaches, but also people who had been perhaps part of ACTA, which I think is, what is that, Association Coach Training Organizations, as well as people that came from other types of associations and modalities. So they really wanted to have both depth and breadth to the way that they were framing these new competencies. They took into account a full range of coaching training, the disciplines, styles, and credentials. So it wasn't just, MCCs sitting around a table. It was a full range of folks with a whole variety of experiences, including internal and external coaches, and all different types of niches that you can imagine. They are considering 2020 to be a transition year. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But basically, if you go to their website, you'll see that when you click on the core competency tab, it still has the current, they call it the current model outlined for everyone. And then at the bottom, they introduce the new model. And they're just now starting to get it translated into different languages. So I believe there's a French, Portuguese, and Spanish version with a German version coming soon to make sure they're serving the global community. And they expect by 2021 to have this fully implemented. So the current model will become the old model. And they will update the coach knowledge assessment. If you have applied for your ACC, or even I think, if you're skipping ahead and you're applying for your PCC and never took that coach's knowledge assessment, the new competencies will be reflected in the questions that they have. And they'll also be looking and assessing recordings for your credentials according to these new competencies starting in 2021. So this is truly a bridge year where we're talking about both sides of the coin, if you will. When you look at the key philosophical points, and this is again just this overview before we dive into the specific competencies, what the ICF wanted to do was to take a look and not just, again, throw it all out and start with a blank page, but what they found through the process is that they were really able to affirm the continued relevance of that original model. They found a lot that is able to be carried over and that is still foundational to excellent coaching. What they've updated is the language and the emphasis of things to be more universal, more global, more inclusive, and you'll see this language repeated throughout the competencies as we go through them, and then considerate of the various stakeholders. So they're taking much more of a systemic approach than just looking at coach and client as, two individuals in a partnership. They're saying the partnership is actually much larger than that. Now, as I'm saying that, I'm guessing, most of us who have been paying attention and intentional about the core competencies recognize that already. Like, we know that coaching doesn't happen in a vacuum. What I appreciate about what they've done is that they've basically codified it and said, we are officially acknowledging that this is important for coaches to do. And if you weren't thinking of it before, it's something important to think about now. Oops. Sorry about that. The other emphasis that they shared that was important is it's not just about doing coaching, like the tactical, procedural process of coaching, but it's also about being a coach. The new competencies and the language are meant to inform your presence as much as anything else. And they do talk about, and I can't remember if it's in the competencies or in the new code of ethics, which they also rolled out, which is effective immediately, that part of being coach is not just how you are carrying yourself and adhering to ethics within the coaching container and partnership, but as you represent yourself as a coach out in the world, if you're wearing that coach hat, not that you're coaching people, but that you are representing the profession and thereby embodying the ethics and the competencies and the presence that you have as a coach. So being able to, recognize that is kind of a slightly different twist than they've had in the past. And then along those lines, their objective was to clarify what it means to be specifically an ICF coach, so that we have language that differentiates us from other coaches who might be part of other associations or other modalities, and makes it, very specific to the international. And now I saw, maybe you saw this in your email today, it's now International Coaching Federation instead of International Coach Federation. So that's hot off the presses today. But they're wanting to clarify, what does it mean to be a member of the International Coaching Federation and adhere to their specific ethics and competencies. In terms of bottom line shifts of emphasis, they have definitely incorporated the ethical considerations of coaching much more prominently. Before, the core competency number 1 was ethics, but it just basically said you adhere to the code of ethics and the difference between coaching, mentoring, consulting, teaching, etc. This time it's much more robust language where they've pulled from the code of ethics and actually made it part of the competencies. And like I said, those new code of ethics are effective. They were effective starting in January. So while there's the transition time for the competencies, the code of ethics is now in full force. And so it's worth it to go through and take a look at what has changed in that. The other piece that they've emphasized more in these competencies than before was reflective practice on the part of the coach and a coach's ongoing professional development. Again, this was an aspect that was outlined and referred to in the code of ethics before, but now they've pulled it into the competency. And one of the questions that came up when Global did a webinar on the new competencies, people were asking, well, what do you mean by reflective practice? And those are the practices that you do outside of the coaching container that raise your own self-awareness, help you cultivate your own presence, your own curiosity. It might be, meditation. It might be some other, journaling or practices that you do. It might be being part of a group of coaches where together you are having conversations and reflecting on your practices and what you're learning as coaches and the challenges and opportunities that you have. So really emphasizing that it's important to not just do coaching, but be coach and to continue to cultivate your own skills. Another big point of emphasis is the integration of context, culture, and systems. It's 2020, and we know that we are increasingly in a very, we're operating in a much more global context than before, and being sensitive and aware of cultural differences, differences that, what people are bringing to the coaching besides just what they tell you, but who they are as a person, what's their cultural context. And that might be geography, race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation. All of that is something to be acknowledged within the coaching partnership. And what they're doing in these competencies is inviting us to bring that in even more and to make sure that we are being very intentional about acknowledging it and using that as part of awareness building and goal setting and moving things forward for clients. They also are having more of an emphasis on partnership language with the client, much more. We've always used that word co-create, and here they're emphasizing that even more and saying, the client has more of an equal voice. I think we know that it is a co-created equal partnership, but the language before, when you really look at the current model, some of it did tend to lean to imply that the coach carries more responsibility for certain things. And they've tried to neutralize that language a bit and put more mutual responsibility on both the coach and the client. And that's also shows up in like the mutual accountability. And then they also emphasize, finally, agreement at every level and stage of coaching. This again was language that was present, but it was rather, it didn't quite have the same gravitas or emphasis. They're reminding us that when we talk about establishing and maintaining agreements, it's not just the agreement you might form with a client within the 30-minute or 60-minute session. It is the agreement that you have from the very start. It's the agreement that you hold over the scope of the partnership. And depending on who the other stakeholders are, it's an agreement with those stakeholders. And that's particularly relevant if you are doing any sort of organizational coaching or team coaching. To make sure you're looking at the agreement from a systems level, as well as from a one-to-one level. Why now? These were some of the frequently asked questions that came up during the global webinar. Why now? It was time. they have a pattern of looking at it about every 10 years. And even when you think about the past 10 years and how much has changed with the way we communicate with each other, with and the explosion of coaching in general, the number of people that are getting trained or not getting trained, but hanging out their shingle. It's really important to continue to look at coaching and the coaching standards that we have, and to be really clear about how are we defining this profession or this modality of supporting people. And so their attention to this was part of due diligence. It's best practice to be able to look at it and say, are these things still true? What is still true? What needs to be updated? And let's give ample resources to making sure that we are providing the best standards that we can. The timeline we've already touched on a bit, but the timeline is, again, that 2020 is this transition year, and 2021 will be when it's in operation in full force. If you have a current credential and you're maintaining it, like say you are renewing your credential this year, nothing really changes for you. You proceed as you always have. If you have a current credential and you're updating it, like say it expires in December of 2021, that's where I'm not sure if, I don't think that you would be required, say, to submit a recording again, or take the coach knowledge assessment again. I can't imagine that they would do that, because that would just be a huge labor-intensive, resource-draining endeavor. So if you have a current credential, my best guess is that you will be able to just kind of make the transition to this language, but it won't change anything about the way that you are renewing your credential. If your credential lapses, that's when you'll really need to pay attention. Like if for some reason you decide I'm not going to renew it, but then maybe 2 years from now you say, I really need to get that back. You will be, it's like you're starting over again from that perspective, and you will have to take the coach knowledge assessment, and you will have to submit recordings and get mentor coaching and do all of those things. So something to keep in mind, an incentive to always keep your credential up to date and renewed. If you have a current credential and you're leveling up, if you're doing it this year, again, you'll be kept to the current model. If you're doing it next year, then you would be looking at the new model. And they're spending the 2020 updating the assessment, that coach's knowledge assessment, which if you're familiar with it, not everybody has taken it, but it's a multiple choice questionnaire that is, I want to say it's about 140 some odd questions that you take online, and you have to get a 70% passing score. And right now, again, all of the questions are based on the current model. They're testing it rigorously this year, and we'll be launching the new assessment next year. So before I go any further, I'm wondering if there are any questions or comments on anything I've shared so far. And if you want to speak, please unmute yourself or share in the chat. I'll just give it a minute. Okay. All right. Well, let me just make sure. Okay, good. So they have, just like before, they have divided up the competencies into sections. We're used to 11 core competencies. Now there are 8, and they've divided them again up into these 4 sections of foundation, co-creating the relationship, communicating effectively, and cultivating learning and growth. Starting with the foundation, and here I'm not going to like read all of this because you can access all of this online. My goal is to just kind of pull out and highlight, literally, some of the new language and what they've done to reinforce some of the things that I was just sharing with you. In particular, with the demonstrates ethical practice, again, you know, they've pulled in a lot of things that were already present in the code of ethics and now put them into the competencies. And so a lot of what you're reading here already was in place. The piece that's much more clarified is that point number 2 is sensitive to clients' identity, environment, experiences, values, and beliefs. And I think that's just an invitation for us to take that into account. It might end up that you, as part of your discovery process with a client, you know, a new client, you might talk about some of those things and say, you know, kind of what's the environment in which you're working? Who are your support system? Where are your support systems? You know, what is going to facilitate you achieving your goals, or what in your environment or your system is going to be holding you back? So being very upfront and aware of those pieces of the system is something that's new that they're bringing into it. They embodies a coaching mindset is the second core competency, and they describe that as being open, curious, flexible, and client-centered. And this is part of that language that says that the clients have an equal voice when they say that clients are responsible for their own choices. And that's new language. They are engaging, the coach is engaging in ongoing learning and development. You have that ongoing reflective practice with the intention of enhancing your coaching. And again, this language is going to keep coming up. You're aware of and open to the influence of context and culture on self, so not just in the client and in others. So looking and having that kind of reflective practice that helps you to reveal your own blind spots, to reveal your own biases, you know, because we all have them, and being aware of them and being aware of how do they enter into the coaching partnership. And what they've done is made this particular competency standalone. You see that in that little circle. It's a new piece of information that's been called out that was previously integrated with the ethics statement. The second section is the co-creating the relationship. Here they've added the word maintains agreements, establishes and maintains agreements, which is a nice additional emphasis. Again, something we probably already did, and it's nice that they put it out there explicitly. And in their definition, they've added some elements, including partners with the client and the relevant stakeholders, whoever they may be. And that might be the organizing sponsor. It might end up being, you know, the person's boss, whoever it might be that is part of that coaching partnership in some way. They might not be in the room with you physically, but they are somehow in the space, if that makes sense. And to make clear goals and agreements about the coaching relationship, as well as for the overall engagement, as well as for each session. And again, the other part that's new in this one is partnering with that client and relevant stakeholders. So making sure that you have a clear process for when you're engaging with a client, to identifying who those stakeholders are, identifying and clarifying what is their role in the partnership and what would be an appropriate way to involve them. And it might just be acknowledging them and saying, you know, my boss is sort of a third person in the room that's invisible. We don't need to talk to him. He doesn't need to know about this, but he he kind of has a stake in this. Like, he knows I'm doing it, but I'm not going to, you know, report back to him. He might be a relevant stakeholder that's important to acknowledge and to say, so does any communication need to happen with him? And if so, what does that look like? And something that you and the client both agree on. Another element that they were more explicit about is partners with the client to end the coaching relationship, not just the session, but the relationship in a way that honors the experience. Paying just as much attention to the beginning of the partnership and those agreements you set as you do to the end. So making sure that the whole arc of the partnership has that that element of acknowledgement, appreciation, and honoring what you have put together. And I believe, you know, I would say that that includes, even if the partnership did not end on a high note, to make sure that there's something there that continues to honor the commitment that person made, the vulnerability that was shared, and helps them understand what might be next for them. Maybe like me, you saw this and you're breathing a sigh of relief because instead of cultivates trust and intimacy, it's trust and safety. They said that the word intimacy was a bit problematic these days. It can have various cultural interpretations. I'd gotten kind of used to it as meaning safety and vulnerability. And across cultures, it doesn't always translate that way. And so they have wisely changed it to safety. And here's where one of the areas I wanted to highlight is coming back to that importance of looking at the system, of seeking to understand the client within their context, which may include their identity, the environment, experiences, values, and beliefs. Maintaining presence is very, again, it mirrors the adopts a coaching mindset when it talks about open, flexible, grounded, and confident. And one thing I appreciated, especially as an introvert, is that they have emphasized creates or allows space for silence, pause, or reflection. Acknowledging that one of the competencies is being able to leave space, to give a client room to process. Introverts in particular are not always verbal processors, and being comfortable with asking a question and letting it hang in the air for maybe what is slightly longer than comfortable. It's nice to see that that is now something that's acknowledged as a strength and a skill to continue to cultivate. The third section is communicating effectively. And actually, before I jump into this, I just want to take a quick check to see if there are any questions so far. Yeah, John, you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, backing up on the learning and development, is there a certain amount of those learning and development opportunities that have to be ICF learnings, or that can they be can they be from other sources?
Yeah, great question. And if I'm to clarify, you're talking about like if you're looking for CCEUs that are supportive of that ongoing learning and reflective practice. Am I following you right?
Yes.
Yes. So as far as I can tell, they're maintaining the requirement that you have 40 CCEUs to apply or renew. And I believe 27 of them need to be core competencies, and the balance of them are resource development. They do not all have to come from like an ICF chapter presentation or an ICF source. They just require that you have some sort of documentation that clarifies, you know, what you learned, who was delivering it, when was it done, that sort of thing. And you can find that information on the website, like what they require. There's also a certain amount of self-study that you can do. So if you've written articles, you've written a book, you've done presentations, some of that can also count.
And do you indicate those learnings on the ICF website?
Yes, they have
Okay.
instituted a new credential application and renewing platform. And apparently you can go in and you can kind of create your profile and start the process of uploading and counting your CCEUs.
Cool.
So as you get one, you can go in, upload it, enter the information, and it will track for you, 1 down, 39 to go kind of thing.
That's per year, annually, you said?
That's annually, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
You.
Actually, no, I take that back. The 40 is for any time you're up for renewal or you're credentialing, and the renewal is every 3 years.
Oh, okay. Every what?
Yeah, every 3.
Every 3. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. Anything else? Brian, you unmuted. Did you mean to? Anyone else? Okay, I'll keep going then. And I'm trying to watch the time. So I'm going to try to move a little bit quickly because I want us to get time for conversation. The third section is communicating effectively, and where they have, again, interwoven language that talks about the system is in this first part under listens actively. Considers the client's context, identity, environment, experience, values, and beliefs. They should make an acronym out of that to make it really quick, because that's the language that they're consistently using. And I should back up and say, one of the key things that they changed that, again, is very subtle, but represents a shift in taking something from being passive to active, is like, if you look at listens actively, this previous core competency was called active listening. And so it was a little bit more passive and puts the action part, last. If you look at how they've reworded these, it's now, the verb and then the adverb after it. So listens actively. Again, a very subtle thing, but there's something about it that feels much more aligned, I think, with the way, with coaching best practices. The other point that they emphasize in the listens actively is notices trends in the client's behaviors and emotions across sessions. So making sure that we are not just actively listening within the session, but that we are, I always say to a client, like, part of my job is to hold the history and to hold the whole arc and to hold their agenda, their capital A agenda. So their little a agenda is what happens within that session. The big A agenda is what we talked about when we first formed the agreement, and it's what they want to achieve over the full arc. And so listens actively applies to the individual session as well as across time and space, especially for when the client can't hold that, or isn't holding it as much as we are. Evokes awareness. This is one where they change the language from creates awareness to evokes. To me, again, it might be hair splitting, but creates almost sounds like it's up to the coach to make sure that you create something, whereas evokes seems much more like it's invitational and it's facilitative. They integrated the word silence in there, again, something I really appreciate. And then finally, as part of evoking awareness, noticing what's working to enhance the client progress. So making sure that we are pointing out what you could call the bright spots, not making sure we're not always dwelling on, well, what's not working and how can we fix it, or how can we change it, but what's working and how can we build on that? So having a very strengths-based approach. The 11th point under evokes awareness, shares observations, insights, and feelings without attachment. I believe this was one of the markers. Like if you look at the core competency table, when they're showing ACC, PCC, MCC markers, they mention this piece about attachment. Now that language has made its way into the core of the language of the competencies. And then finally, and this is one of my favorite, and I think the best improvement that they've made, is previously we had 3 more competencies to go, and they were under the titles of designing actions, planning and goal setting, managing progress and accountability. And if you've ever spent some time talking about those particular competencies and looking at them, it could get a little bit murky because there was so much overlap. They seemed like, why don't you just mash them up together? And that's exactly what they did. And they're calling it facilitates client growth. So you're partnering with the client to transform learning and insight into action, and you're promoting client autonomy. That goes back to their principle of the client taking equal responsibility for their progress and their learning. You can see under number 7, you know, a lot of this language here that you're seeing was pulled from and combined from the designing actions, planning and goal setting, and managing progress and accountability. And then they've added celebrates the client's progress and successes. So again, noticing the bright spots and how to build on them. And then partners with the client to close the session. Not just, again, you know, putting emphasis on the beginning and putting emphasis on how things close, and making sure that all of that is done in such a way that honors the relationship and celebrates their learning. So with that, that's my big picture overview and emphasis, or, you know, sharing what has been updated. And I'd love to just open things up to conversation. And rather than keep my screen shared, I'm just going to quickly, you know, say these questions, and feel free to write them down or do whatever's good for you. They're pretty obvious questions, but I'd like to stop sharing the screen so that we can all see each other. So just noticing what stands out to you about the changes. What do you see as positive? Like, what are you excited about to see put into this? Do you see any challenges or concerns, especially if you're used to the prior competency model? And maybe most importantly, in what way does the shifting emphasis towards ethical practice, ongoing professional development, the context, culture, and systems, and partnership most profoundly impact you? So do you see anything in this new model that will influence your, you know, the way you're forming agreements, the communication you have with clients, or the approach that you have with others? So with that, I'm going to stop the screen sharing. And I invite us to, you know, if you want to unmute and come on in, and let's just throw out any of those questions, whatever resonates with you. Would love to hear what's on your mind.
I'll share Gary left a comment that client language is used instead of coachee.
Yep. Feels a lot better. What
For
else?
me, I really liked, I'm an extrovert, so it can be a challenge. My wife's an introvert, so one of my early challenges with the coaching process was those silent spaces and learning to leave those. So I really like that, allows space for silence. What was that? Or reflection, pauses, silence, pauses, or reflection. So really making that explicitly part of the coaching process, I think, you know, will be helpful to both introverts and extroverts.
Absolutely. Might be more of a growth edge for the extrovert and a welcome addition from the introvert. What else?
As a mentor coach, and in the process that I was taught for doing that, we use the PCC markers, whether it's for an ACC or a PCC, as you're doing the mentor coaching written feedback. And it was always so clear to me that there were very few for creating awareness, which in the type of coaching that most ministry leaders that I'm aware of use. But there were just tons and tons and tons for, all right, help the client create the action steps, and then implement them, and the plan. And it just seemed to me that it was skewed very much for the type of clients that I have and other coaches that I've mentored have had. I also really like the absence of the word accountability, because somehow that always sounds to me like the principal or somebody is going to be grading you and putting it in your permanent record And I had started in my own practice a couple of years ago, instead of saying, what accountability would be useful, to say, what will help to support you to move forward with your action steps. But I like the new language in the updated competencies even better.
Yeah, great. And one of the things, yeah, I agree with you. And one of the questions I'll ask, like, what are you committed to? As another way of saying, what actions or what's going to support you. And I'm hoping, they didn't mention this, but I'm hoping they come out with a new table that shows those markers to update that. They did not mention when that would, they didn't even acknowledge that piece. So I'm hoping that comes up sometime in the very near future.
It almost will have to, since I understand that the ICF assessors use those and have some mysterious points assigned to those when they're reviewing recordings we submit. So I would assume that it's going to be essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would expect they're probably taking this year to put that together. Yeah.
Could I go back to that comment about client language? The reason I put that out there is I was just starting, many in the group will resonate with this, I think. Starting with a new client yesterday who was receiving spiritual direction, and a number of the folks who we work with in coaching, of course, they have others whom they talk with, and those include spiritual directors, could be pastoral psychotherapists, etc. And so who that person is in the relationship with a coach is very important. So I was explaining to this person who had not experienced coaching before, what is coaching that is different from spiritual direction, and it's not psychotherapy. He's involved with both of those as well. And I was using that awkward feeling word coachee, to differentiate. But it really has felt to me like these folks are clients, and that's my default language. I'm just wondering if that for others has been something you've been running into, where there are multiple people that our coachees or clients are working with, and you're trying to define who they are in relation to you.
Great question.
I find that comes up almost every time with every new client. And I keep remembering the very first day that my cohort at the former Auburn Theological Seminary training program, when we walked into the room where our training occurred, they had there was a circle and all of these concentric circles that went around it, showing where there was the overlap between the different disciplines, but there was a section in the very middle that was very distinct, that was coaching. And I try to use some language around that there are some places where there might seem to be some overlap, such as psychotherapy or counseling is particularly helping you to look at and heal something from the past so that you can move forward. In coaching, there may be times where we talk about the past because that's an important piece briefly for you to determine how you're going to move forward, but it isn't where we dwell. That coaching is forward-looking and action-oriented. So that idea of there's some overlapping shading, but coaching is distinctive, helps me with that.
And having really clear language around it is helpful to communicate to them, because say if someone is receiving both modalities, to understand what the difference is between the two. And if you are the same person providing them, in which I don't know how often that happens, but to be clear which container you're holding in that moment. What else? Either in response to what Gary was just saying, or in response to the competencies.
I really like about the understanding your sort of cultural context and the whole focus on reflective practices. I mean, just awakening to the fact that, I guess sort of as a white person, as a white male, I sort of have a normal paradigm of what I consider to be sort of typical and normal, but that's really not the case. So even language, right, around moving to safety instead of intimacy, right, how that would be. So I really appreciate the wisdom, I think, in trying to broaden the wording to include ideas and thoughts and ways of feeling safe that are much more broadly thought of. One of the questions I had was how, like especially that second competency, how would you possibly demonstrate that, in a coaching session? And part of this seems like it's really more about an ongoing practice or some ways of being a coach, but I'm sort of wondering how they would evaluate that. I mean, how would they know if you're doing some of these things? Is there going to be a different way to prove to the ICF folks that these things are actually being done in a competent way?
That's a great question. And I know I think when it comes to the coach knowledge assessment, I think they were talking about having just a few questions about, again, these are multiple choice, right? So your ability to identify reflective practices is something of an indication. Like, what do you consider to be a reflective practice? And if I remember correctly, they said that when it comes to like assessing a call or, assessing a recording, it's kind of like before the markers for the first one about demonstrates ethical practice, they basically said, if you violate, it wasn't like we're looking for this, we're looking to make sure you don't do XYZ, making sure you don't slip into consulting. If you do that at all, then it's disregard, you're out. And if I'm remembering right, they said that it's kind of one of those things that they can listen for, and you can tell if somebody's doing it or not. If you are continuing to sharpen your skills, if you are demonstrating confidence and trust, you're right. It's it's not an objective, measurable thing. But they implied that there's, kind of, if you're doing it, it might not be totally obvious if you're doing it. It's probably going to be obvious if you're not.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But that is one of those fuzzy places.
And I guess I also like the whole thing about, from doing the work of a coach merely to really being a coach, and what that's about in terms of your essence, and not just an activity you try to learn to do well, but
right. Yeah. It's something that you try to embody.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else did you notice or stood out to you? And does this make you think a little differently about any aspect of your coaching or the partnerships you have?
I think in a lot of ways what has been said, and I would resonate with, is it's really about also the coach's growth, not just the client's success. And that in the way of any of us becoming more self-aware, that's as important a task as coaching someone else.
Absolutely. Yes. Agreed. Other thoughts?
Well, here's one more to think about it. Few clients know how to be a client. They learn how to be a client in the process of the coaching. And it seems like this model calls upon the clients to be proactive and mutual partners in the coaching that's done.
Yes.
Seems like most come to coaching looking for a commodity to be delivered. And it's a one-sided relation. And they learn the dance, how to balance.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's putting much more of that emphasis on the co-creation and the mutual responsibility for what happens in the partnership. Taking some of that language that put an emphasis on the coach and saying the client. And I think it calls us to look at, for me, like, how am I shaping the agreement with the client in such a way that makes it clear that this is a collaborative partnership. And, even going beyond just saying the movement is not necessarily going to happen in the sessions, it's going to happen in between the sessions. And what does that mean? And spending a little bit more time talking about that.
It's funny how much that sounded like congregational ministry, Gary, as you were talking.
Well, I know we're right up against the top of the hour, so I'm feeling like I probably need to turn this over to Dana for any wrap up.